Management Plans Work Group, Municipal Subgroup. I do want to remind everybody we don't have defined membership as a part of this group. If you would like to participate, come sit at the table, please feel free. We do have a webinar running, and we do record these meetings to post on the website later. So if you do have something to say, we would really appreciate it if you would speak into the microphone so the people on the webinar can hear you. And also just state your name for the benefit of those on the webinar. My name is Natalie Mast. I am the program manager working on the management plans here at ADWR, and I do have some additional ADWR staff with me today. We have McKenna Welsh and Maggie Martin in the back helping out with our webinar, so they're doing a fantastic job on that. And I also have a brand new management plan staff. She just started yesterday. Amanda Long-Rodriguez has just joined the department, so we're really excited to have her. And sitting at the table with me, I also have Caitlin Parker, who is our municipal planner, and Kyle Miller, who is the AMA data and planning manager. So I really appreciate them being here to help me out today. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are focusing on the non-per capita conservation program today, and kind of want to look at both the larger structure of the program, what the requirements of the program are currently, and also look at the individual BMPs. There are a lot of BMPs in this program, and I'm not super convinced we're actually going to make it through all of them today, but that's okay. We will get through what we can, and we can kind of continue this conversation at a future meeting. For the BMPs that we'll talk through, I'll get to this in a later slide, but I did want to say we did receive quite a bit of feedback on the BMPs through the feedback on the draft Phoenix 4th Management Plan. So we will be talking about some of that feedback that we received during that, some of which was incorporated into that plan and some of which we kind of wanted to hold off on so that we could have conversations about it in this group. So we'll go ahead and get started. So basic overview of the program. The Non-Per Capita Conservation Program is a BMP program for large municipal providers. This is the kind of default option for providers that are not designated. So, but providers that are designated can opt into this program using the provider profile. Depending on the number of connections that a provider has, there are different levels of requirements for how many additional BMP points that the provider has to achieve. That points clarification I just made is something new for those remaining 4th management plans, where we're going away from just counting up the BMPs and going more toward a point system where different BMPs may be weighted slightly differently. So there are 7 categories currently for those BMPs. Excuse me. And many of the suggestions that we received under the 4th management plan had to do with restructuring these categories, splitting the categories, focusing more on the difference between residential and non-residential, that kind of thing. We did, as I said, we incorporated some of those comments that we received for the Phoenix 4th Management Plan. But we also want to, as a part of this group, kind of consider these categories, make sure that they're still serving their purpose, make sure that this is how we would like to structure those BMPs, or perhaps consider whether this should be different, whether there should be a different categories, anything like that. So there is one BMP that all municipal providers in this program have to do, which is a basic public information program. This particular BMP does not count toward that point total, but all providers are required to do this. So I'm not going to spend too much time on there. It's pretty basic in nature, providing information to the public. this particular chart, so all of the points that count toward that total for providers' BMPs have to be accumulated kind of from that remaining list. That first BMP doesn't count as a point, so all of your points have to come from the rest of the list. According to those tiers that I mentioned, so 3, 8, or 15 points under the remaining fourth management plans, or I think it was 1, 3, or 10 under the third management plan. Maybe it was 1, 5, or 10. Anyway. So what we wanted to look at is kind of start thinking about which of those remaining or kind of leftover BMPs are used frequently, which ones, how do we consider the effectiveness of these BMPs? And what you can kind of see here, so the axis along the bottom is just the BMPs in the order in which they occur in the third management plan. And what you can see is that there's kind of a cutoff right around Category 5 that what we kind of assume is happening here is not that people are not using those BMPs further down the list, but rather people probably just stop reporting them once they get to their assigned number of points. So we don't necessarily think that this data is complete in terms of the BMPs that people are actually implementing. But what we can see, at least in this data, is that there are a few BMPs that are implemented very frequently. The most implemented BMPs, I know this is a little bit hard to read for those in the back, sorry about that. So the top 3 here are meter repair replacement, customer high water use inquiry resolution, and customer high water use notification. So those are the most frequent ones. And then for the least implemented ones, we also have those listed, but again, it's a little bit hard to tell on that end of the spectrum whether those are just not being reported or if they're actually not being implemented. So what I'd like to do now is kind of start to walk through those individual BMPs. There was a handout on the sign-in table that contains the language. That particular handout is from the Phoenix Draft Fourth Management Plan, so it's kind of the most updated version of that language that we have. So what we'd like to do is kind of walk through these individual BMPs and both talk about the type of feedback we've received on these already, and also get some feedback from those of you who are present on should these be adjusted? Or do we need to be considering additional BMPs? Are there additional things that we should be considering here? A lot of the feedback that we did receive under the fourth management plan on the BMPs had to do with the points that we assigned them, whether they were combined residential or non-residential, and also a lot of the feedback that we received had to do with the reporting side of things. What needs to be included on the CER? What type of quantitative data can we apply, can we get from each of these individual BMPs in order to better understand them? So that'll be kind of something that we want to consider as we walk through this. Are there any questions or comments or anything before I jump into the first BMP here? Cool. All right. The first BMP that we have on this list, so 1.1, if you're looking at the packet that was on the sign-in table, is local or regional conservation campaign. So this is a kind of an advertising thing. This BMP has been carried over, I believe, in several versions of the management plans. And something that was proposed for this particular BMP is changing the limit for the number of points for this BMP to up to 3 points. So that could be something that we consider as a part of this group. Does anybody have any thoughts on that particular item?
Natalie, can you elaborate up to 3 points for?
My understanding there is, so right now that particular BMP is worth 1 point. Sorry. That particular BMP is worth 1 point. I think what the 3 point suggestion proposal there would mean is if there were individual separate campaigns that you could get multiple points for those separate campaigns within a single calendar year. Is that something, is that a change that people would be generally supportive of? Is that, oh goodness, sorry. Is that something that's seen as effective?
Natalie? I mean, personally, I would want to see this limited at 1 point. I see a lot of shared messages between different campaigns and platforms. And so I just think it might be a little overkill to allow up to 3 points for an effort that could very easily be multiplied with very little effort.
Just to add on to that, it seems like there might be overlap with the local or regional conservation campaign and the required basic public information program that everyone is already having to do.
This one isn't quite loud enough. And I think that there probably is some overlap there. I think the intent is that the local or regional conservation campaign should be a little bit more extensive. Yeah. So what I'm hearing, though, at least at this point, is that 1 point total for that particular BMP should be the limit, and it should remain at that. Okay. The next item on the list is special events / programs or community presentations. And again, this is a public education thing. This category 1 is public awareness, public relations. So the BMPs in this section are all going to have some component of education, just in various formats or forums. Where the local or regional conservation campaign might be things like advertising, it says specifically television, radio, or print, this item 1.2 is a little bit more specific to in-person events. That is currently listed as 1 point, and the requirement that was included in the Phoenix Fourth Management Plan was that the provider must conduct 3 events in a given year in order to get the point for this one. Is that reasonable? Should it be more, fewer events? Should it be a different number of points? Are there any thoughts on that? John?
Just as a thought, a very large provider attending 3 events may not have the same impact as a smaller provider attending 3 events as a percentage of your customer base.
Okay.
Not that I have a problem with
it. Would you be suggesting that the number of events maybe be different according to the tiers or something along those lines?
Something to consider.
Okay. Yeah, and that type of thing is certainly something that we're open to. I think that could be a reasonable thing to incorporate here. Yeah, okay. The next item, item 1.3, is market surveys to identify customer information needs or assess the success of conservation measures. This particular one is worth 2 points, at least partially because we know that this type of thing can be a little bit more work or money intensive than some of the other items on the list. but this is related to a market survey used to improve the water provider's current water conservation activities or to plan future activities. This particular BMP is worth 2 points, but it is limited to being used once every 5 years. Does anybody have any thoughts either on the points of that, on the requirements there, on this particular BMP? Jake?
Natalie, I think the BMP is well positioned for that kind of activity and the points and the timing. However, there's a hard overlap with the commission, and and I don't know if this is dialogues happened earlier in these meetings, the municipal subgroup, or in the future. But how are we working with commission staff so they understand? They've kind of created their own conservation program for us regulated utilities, and we're torn a little bit in two different ways sometimes.
Sure, understood. So my understanding, my limited understanding, I should say, is that the ACC has largely adopted the BMPs as kind of written in the existing management plans. So as there are changes to those BMPs, the ACC would then probably adjust in order to match our BMPs. I think that's going to have to kind of be an ongoing thing where the details of that are determined, but it's certainly something that we're aware of.
Okay, it's something that we bring to different levels of staff there, and we'll work on it with them and with you as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Jake.
Question, Natalie. On that, are you open to other types of data gathering?
Absolutely.
Besides just market surveys, and is that clear?
So data gathering in terms of?
Let's say you do focus groups instead of market surveys.
I don't know if that would be covered under this particular BMP. That could certainly be something that we consider. I'm trying to remember if that might be covered under a different BMP. But it kind of seems like this might be the one. So you would propose to include focus groups as kind of under the definition of market survey, potentially? Okay. All right. Moving on to 1.4. The 1.4 is distribution plan for water conservation materials. So
Natalie?
Oh, yes? Someone on the phone?
This is John Anderson in the town of Florence. I'm sort of new at this, but what does CER stand for?
Good question. Thank you. CER is the Conservation Efforts Report. So as a part of this program, in order to get the points associated with these BMPs, you have to submit, each provider has to submit a conservation efforts report with their annual report, which details the BMPs that they implemented in that reporting year and provides some additional information on how that BMP was implemented and that type of thing. Typically, with each individual BMP, there's specific requirements of what needs to be included in the CER in order to get the points for that BMP.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to distribution plan for water conservation materials. No? Okay. So this particular one is limited to only 1 year, so you can only get points for this BMP one time in under each management plan. And the BMP is requiring the development of a 2-year distribution plan for those water conservation materials and programs. So this is kind of more of a coordinating and planning type BMP rather than actually conducting the outreach as the other ones tend to be. Does anybody have any thoughts on this BMP, the limitations here, any questions here? We did have a proposal on this one. Okay, so there was a proposal related to this particular BMP that we received under the Phoenix Fourth Management Plan. But we will, the proposal was actually to get rid of this BMP and replace it with something else. I have the text of that brand new BMP proposal on a later slide, so we'll get to that a little bit later. All right. So moving into Category 2. Category 2 is conservation, education, and training. And again, maybe something to consider as a part of the fifth management plans, as a part of this group, is whether there's too much overlap between the categories, whether there's too much overlap between BMPs. Is there any restructuring that we would like to do to this program that we should consider for the fifth management plans? We are considering ways to streamline this program, but also to consider how we might make this program more effective. So just something to keep in mind as we work our way through these. So 2.1, the first one under this category is adult education or training program. This one is specifically for adults in the provider's service area. So some of the other outreach and education type BMPs are really focused just kind of on the general public, where this is specifically within the service area, specifically for adults. And for potentially for homeowners or training programs for landscape professionals. So some of the changes that we included in the Phoenix Fourth Management Plan were to the reporting requirements associated with these BMPs, sometimes requiring a little bit more detail for each for the reporting that needs to be included on the CER. So what we were really trying to do was trying to make that reporting kind of as quantitative as possible. So you can see here, I think, I'm not remembering exactly what the previous requirement was, but the new requirement here, if you have that handout from the sign-in table, you can see that the provider must state in its CER the number and type of trainings or education programs and the number of attendees per training. So we're really trying in some way, it's not quite a water savings thing, but we really do want to try to quantify things a little bit more rather than just saying, is this BMP effective or not? Something that we have struggled a little bit with on the reporting side of things is, I know there's a checkbox on the CER that is, what is the wording on it? Is it effectiveness of the BMP? And what we see a lot of times is either all of those boxes are reported as neutral or all of those boxes are reported as highly effective. So we don't necessarily have very good confidence in that data either. So there's a lot of room for improvement on the reporting side of things in this program. So the stakeholder the stakeholder proposal associated with this particular BMP, part of that proposal was to split this BMP into residential and non-residential types of programs. So one would be focused on your homeowners, adults in the service area. One might be focused on landscape professionals, that type of thing in the service area. Does anybody have any thoughts about that particular proposal? About splitting these into residential, non-residential?
Are you proposing then 3 points under residential and 3 points under non-residential for a total of 6 points to come from education?
If we were going to split it, I would probably not go that direction. So something that you'll see throughout this is that there are a number of proposals for splitting pretty systematically into residential and non-residential categories. I think something that maybe we should consider under this group is perhaps limiting the number of points from each category. Although I guess that would have to be, now that I'm saying that out loud, I apologize. Now that I'm saying that out loud, I guess the limits would have to be based on which tier you're in too. So we're open to suggestions on how exactly those points are structured, but as you kind of implied there, 6 might kind of be a lot from that particular BMP.
Yeah, I like the idea of splitting a lot of these BMPs into residential and non-residential, and also kind of weighting the points to come from different categories. But I think that that's something that should probably be discussed before we go through all of the BMPs and assign points to them, because that may influence how many points overall we want to assign to a particular category if we're limiting how many you can get from one.
Okay. So maybe this is a good place to kind of pause and have a little bit of that discussion on related to in an overall way splitting a lot of these BMPs, focusing some BMPs more on the non-residential side, focusing some more on the residential side. Is that kind of in concept something that people are generally supportive of? Or is there some other route that people would consider going?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we're considering, because as a municipal provider, where our water use is happening is very different between residential and non-residential areas. You can work with a non-residential customer and get a lot bigger bang for your buck, but it's a lot more an investment of time. So lumping them sometimes into one category, it becomes very difficult as a provider, because I can essentially run some OWEX on a couple of small single-family residential customers, OWEX, outdoor water efficiency checks, but it's not going to be nearly as impactful as working with a large industrial customer, like a hospital in our commercial program. So I think that's part of the rationale, and if you want to talk about data and splitting that up and seeing where the savings is coming from, I think it's going to be much more effective to really split those categories and see where that water savings are happening.
Okay. So maybe what I'm hearing from there is if we're considering limiting the number of points per category, we might have a lower limit under that residential category and a higher limit under the non-residential category.
Potentially. From a municipal standpoint, running a commercial program is a lot more time intensive than running residential, and other municipal providers jump in. I guess it varies per city as well. I mean, what I have in Scottsdale is going to be different than what's in Gilbert, but it's something to consider.
Okay. Thank you. Did anybody else have any comments on that? Maggie's going to bring you a microphone. Thank you.
So I would want to put a little bit of caution of weighting too much more for the commercial than the residential. As many cities, the residential is still their bulk. And even though it might be a little less of yes, it's a little less time consuming, but if you can reach more numbers, you're reaching more people that way. So yes, sometimes you get a bigger bang for your buck water-wise with commercial, but there's fewer of them. So long term, we're still going to be reaching for a lot of the residential customers as well. So wouldn't want to skew those two separately when it comes to how they're weighted.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. So it kind of seems like the direction we'll probably end up going for the fifth management plans is we'll probably have to do some restructuring of the categories, that kind of thing, considering exactly how those points fall. But it sounds like the direction that I'm hearing, at least from this group, is that we should probably do a little bit more clarification on splitting between residential and non-residential and kind of focusing those different categories. So with that, maybe the points values. Oh, sorry, Patrick, did you? Oh, okay. Just waving your hands around. It's all right. So maybe the points values here aren't specifically as relevant, but what I would still like to hear today as we work through these BMPs is whether there are things that maybe we have listed here as only 1 point that you all see as more productive, that maybe should be weighted a little bit higher, or vice versa, if we have it listed as 2 or 3 points and you think it should be lower. I'm curious, I would like to hear some feedback on what the points are assigned here, just so that we have that feedback as we're kind of working through restructuring this list. So I'll go ahead and move on to the youth education program, number 2.2. I won't spend too much time here. This one's pretty similar to item 2.1, but just focusing on kids instead of adults. So often school-type programs, that kind of thing. Does anybody have any questions or comments on this particular one before I move on? We did have a proposal to limit that one up to 3 points, but again, I think we'll probably need to come back to that as we work through restructuring this. The next item on the list is new homeowner landscape information. So this one is distributing information packets to all owners of newly constructed homes. So this is currently required, I believe, to be a physical delivery. I know there was some discussion of creating more of an online presence. Currently, the online distribution is only by request if it's requested by the homeowner. And also, this BMP requires the provider to notify new owners of existing homes that information is available online. That information is available. So this one's a little bit kind of roundabout, but is there any consideration here? Is this something? I guess the question I would have here is whether the online distribution is seen as effective as compared to the physical distribution of those materials. My kind of instinct there is that a homeowner is going to be getting, like a new homeowner is going to be getting both a lot of papers and a lot of emails and that kind of thing, and either one could pretty easily be ignored, although in my personal experience I tend to ignore junk emails that I get more frequently than the physical stuff. So I don't know. I guess I'm curious on the side of the providers if you've seen any feedback or had any questions related to getting that information in a physical manner or by email or electronically.
So we've been seeing these requests go down even as we proactively offer them. And looking at this BMP, it seems like it could be captured underneath the messaging distribution plan that we had under, I think it was under Category 1, and also the online portion of it is also very easily captured under having a messaging campaign. So I would just be wary of having too many available points for handing out information as opposed to engaging with things where you can measure water savings.
Okay. So this might be a potential one for removing it or combining it with something else.
Hi, Dina with Chandler. This doesn't necessarily apply directly, but I mean, my other concern with just sending out materials to send out materials. And like you say, you get a lot when you do purchase a new home, and a lot of those go in the trash. And if we're talking about conservation, it's a lot of printing and materials that we're just sending out to be disposed of. So it's not very conservation-minded from that perspective. Just a consideration to think about.
When you say packets, do you actually mean a physical packet, or would a rack card with information suffice in the small envelope?
The BMP says landscape information packets, but perhaps that's something I'm not sure of the physical nature of what's been done in the past by.
Something that I've used before is just a rack card that lists all of the AMWA guides, lists the, water use it wisely, lists different things. So then customers can go get those digitally instead of sending a $7 packet with, $5 to $7 worth of materials into every new homeowner, be able to reduce it to that. It's still paper, it's still some trash, but it's less than a giant packet.
So perhaps if we were to maintain this BMP, we could edit it to be a little more limited in the printing, maybe. But maybe what I'm hearing more is that possibly this BMP could be combined with some of the other ones. Okay. I'm seeing some nods around the room.
Yeah. I was just going to Adria from Scottsdale Support that it could probably encapsulate it under Category 1. I think it's actually more appropriate for there. If we're talking about Category 2 in general as a conservation and education and training program, I like to emphasize more on the training, which is why we got into the residential and non-residential kind of discussion to begin with. It's more of that hands-on, physical, really diving deeper. And I'm just going to throw out there as well, I think this just applies in general to the topic, is we talk about how originally the data we were gathering from a lot of these categories weren't really informative. And so we're going to have these discussions, but at the same time, I think when we start getting more data-driven BMPs, then we'll have more information to make better assessments. But sometimes some of these things we don't quite have the data yet, so I just want to emphasize that again.
Thank you. Another question, comment?
Sorry, I've been dying to ask this question on the data point perspective. Do we have information about actual actual value, perceived value, feedback from these programs and things like that? And how much of that is, when I'm speaking of actual versus perceived value, is there some technical assistance that is being offered as the sort of prize for responding and all of that, or how is that being measured over the years? Because I think some of these informational programs have been around for quite a while.
Sure. So I think that's a difficulty kind of by nature with these informational type of programs, that it's pretty hard to measure water savings associated with an informational program. So there are several BMPs that even in the fourth management plan we're trying to get more information, more quantitative type information to better understand that kind of perception or effectiveness thing. But as is, and even going forward, that is something where that type of data is going to be difficult to generate and analyze. There is a BMP somewhere later that was related to analyzing the BMP. Sorry, I'm not remembering exactly which one it was, but yeah. There is a BMP in here that's the one, thank you, that you can receive points for conducting an analysis of a single BMP and reporting that information back to us so that we can kind of share that information. But again, that type of thing is kind of limited in scope. So it is something we hope to improve on, but as of now, the data that we have related to the individual BMPs and the effectiveness of each individual BMP is a little bit limited.
Natalie, on 2.3, I think that new homes and new landscapes are the place in the decision point still where a homeowner can choose to use water or not, by what they plant, particularly in the backyard as they build. And I don't want to lose it altogether. I understand where it kind of has duplicative efforts in one and whatnot, but and I don't know how we try to put some sideboards on to make sure it's effective, or perhaps that we're reaching people at the right point. But I think it's important, because if we can keep new backyards to low water use landscaping, there is a huge save there.
Okay, that's good feedback. Thank you, Jake. So perhaps if we were going to combine this with another BMP, perhaps there could be some kind of a combined BMP that's outreach options, where you can do one or maybe two of this list of 5 things, and it's up to 2 or 3 points depending on how we structure it. I'm kind of spitballing here.
Yeah, perhaps. I'm not sure. I know there's a big decision point once you plant certain things. Okay. You're kind of married to them. To spend $10,000 on your landscape or something like that, you're going to water it. And if you make that different choice in the beginning, maybe there's a better way to reach people than this kind of. At that time when you get the most junk email in your life when you get home. So I can't think of it now, but just don't want to lose the effort there.
Fair enough.
Just to add on to that, I like what you're saying, and I agree with you 100% on that. But maybe what we do is we kind of change it from an informational to an education, a new homeowner education program, and maybe it's sending out packets, but maybe it's actually offering some kind of direct outreach where we reach out, or maybe when they're calling in to establish their new water service, our CSR spends some time on the phone with them, educating them on what information is available, and the fact that our landscape here in the valley is completely different than anywhere else. So if they're from some other location, we can provide them with direction as to where to go to find the resources to establish a water-efficient landscape and or other water-efficient interior products, things like that.
Okay. Yeah, that seems like a good creative solution. I like that. Thank you, Dina. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to the last item on here, the Xeriscape demonstration garden. I think most of you are familiar with what this means. This one is currently listed as 1 point, and we didn't really get any additional feedback on that particular item. Does anybody have any comments or anything on the demonstration garden item? All right. Check where we're at on time.
Natalie, can I just jump back? I wanted to pull up what we had as the other BMPs before I commented on the landscaping one. We do have here, at least in the 4th, and I assume it's in the 5th, a requirement for water-efficient landscapes and model homes, which that would kind of capture the turning point of when people are installing landscapes. We could combine having messaging and training available to go along with showing a water-efficient landscape, and that way there's not too many duplicative points across the board. I think if someone moves into a house, if they're just a new homeowner and they move into a house that has an already established lawn, they're not going to be making a lot of really dramatic changes at that point. So we could maybe tie it to the model home ordinance. I don't know if that sounds good to other municipalities, other providers as well.
Any comments on that one? It sounds like it could have some potential to me. Might be worth looking into.
We don't promulgate ordinances but we may be able to do that through tariff, and it's working with that third-party group, the builders, to ensure they have that. So that's kind of another part removed that makes it harder to accomplish. But maybe I can look into it and come back and report on how we can make that happen as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. If there are no other comments on that section, we've got about 15 minutes left here today. Let's see how far we can get in Category 3 before I kind of jump to the end here. So Category 3, again, is outreach services. So as we've kind of been talking about, a lot of these are kind of educational outreach in nature. But these are outreach services is maybe a little bit more focused one-on-one on those types of interactions. So the first one here is, whoops, I didn't switch the screen. There we are. The first one here is Residential Audit Program. And again, this is something that we will consider splitting into residential and non-residential. There was a proposal that we received under the fourth management plan related to combining this with the number 3.2, which is landscape consultations, which is also on the screen here. So perhaps the residential audit plus landscape consultation would be split into residential, non-residential. So it would just be a water audit, indoor and outdoor, for both residential and non-residential users, split as two separate BMPs. I don't feel like I'm saying that in an elegant way, but does that seem like something that would be a little bit more intuitive for this particular BMP, is kind of combining that indoor-outdoor audit function? See a couple nods, a couple confused faces.
I think, sorry, Adria with Scottsdale. I think the way that it was structured in the 3MP is when you have an audit program and then you separate the landscape consultation, often when a provider goes out to the home, it may start as one and then ends up as another, or you end up doing both. If you're chasing a leak, you might start indoors and go outdoors, talk about landscape. So in terms of data reporting, I think splitting it out, or splitting it to residential and non-residential, and then just combining just a general audit program, indoor-outdoor, you're going to have kind of a better data pool, especially if we put in additional reporting and the CER just saying, did you do indoor, did you do outdoor, did you do both? So from a municipal standpoint, it'd be easier for us to track, and I think it would give you a better data pool, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Okay. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So we're looking at item 3.3, water budgeting program. Again, there was a proposal to split this between residential and non-residential with the water budgeting. I'm not. So maybe this is something that you all can help me understand a little bit better. Is how is this very different than the auditing, or is there some overlap there? Should these maybe be combined?
It's kind of the same problem where you go out to a site and you start having a conversation with the user, and then it develops from an audit to a budget. I think the way that the budget is written is more defined. We talk about having deliverables and then providing additional services beyond the budget in terms of tracking that water use as well. There's a lot of effort that goes into that, especially for the non-residential. On sites, they have multiple meters under multiple different accounts, much larger landscapes. It can become very complicated. So going out and doing an audit is usually just generally assessing the water use, seeing if there's any leaks. At a commercial, I mean, they may have water use 24/7, but the budgeting program is a bit more intense and is for us used to track water use over time. An audit may be a quick in and out. You provide a report and you never follow up with them again. But a budget, especially if you build it into a program like a platform, can really produce long-term savings.
So would that be a reason to apply more points for the budgeting as compared to the audit?
I think it kind of depends on how many points we end up giving to commercial audits when we get there. AMWA had talked about in their proposal for the fourth management plan that we kind of have like, we split up the audits into residential and non-residential. We can almost kind of write a scaled up version of it. So you've got like the first steps of say like a mini audit, and then the next steps of, you know, going out there and working on the landscape, because that's where a lot of the water savings is. And then a water budget could be the next step. And so we could kind of shift the way that those are all presented and make them more of a package that I think would guide people as they're building programs to think about all of the steps that they might take when they build one program. And then the points could add up that way as you go more in depth to those different audits.
So structuring it as more sequential rather than as increasing points necessarily. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, I think that would be more effective when you're when a provider is looking to build a program. If they're looking at these BMPs and they're thinking about what should I add, what should I do next, we're kind of piecing together the steps as opposed to just them looking like, oh, I'll grab this one, or oh, this one looks like it's not going to take a lot of time, and just piecemealing something together.
Okay. So perhaps we could do something like each of the BMPs is worth 1 point on its own, but if all three are implemented, then there's an extra point or something assigned, where you're kind of combining them in that sequential type thing. Is that kind of the direction you might think, or?
So kind of like if you're reaching out, perhaps if you're doing, well, let's just look at it from a residential perspective. So if you're doing high water use notifications and resolutions over the phone, perhaps that's your first point there. And I know that those are two of the most common used BMPs. And then your next step would be, are you actually going out to the landscape and helping people problem solve? Because you're putting a lot more time in it if you're making site visits as opposed to just doing things over the phone or mailing letters. So then you're at 2 points. And then if you're going kind of the next step, which is perhaps you've got an online platform where you're building a budget for them, or you're creating a customized budget and just like printing it out and leaving it with them, then that's the third step, and you get 3 points.
Okay, we might have to explore that one a little bit more. I think there could be some potential there.
And I think it's really important that when we talk about budgets that we define what qualifies as a budget and how it's delivered, because it can be a pretty broad term. So when we talk about assigning more points, you know, I like the sequential, you know, we talked about that at AMWA. I think it's great, but there's a big difference between providing a budget on site and then walking away, or providing a platform and regular updates and alerts that, hey, you're over budget this month. So there's a lot of variability there, so we would really have to, I think, define what a budget is.
Sorry, I probably should have sat at the table. Just to add on to that, by tiering it out in the after data, you would be able to get more true data as well, because if they're doing, you know, the Tier 1 audit, you would get the water savings from that. A Tier 2 audit, you would see the water savings from those. And then you would be able to legitimize which audit is more effective on the total water savings.
Well, we are running a little bit low on time today, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of start wrapping up here. I do really, really appreciate you all being engaged. I know this is kind of dry as we're working through these individual BMPs, so I really do appreciate the participation and feedback today. So we will continue these conversations working through these BMPs in a subsequent meeting. But what I'm also hearing perhaps on our side that we'll need to do is kind of working through these and coming up with some kind of a proposal to bring back to you all related to how we might restructure this, what that new type of system might look like. So we'll try to have some of that at our next meeting as well. So let me jump ahead a little bit here. We do also, as we're working through these BMPs, we do also want to consider whether there are BMPs that are just totally missing from here, things that could be effective that we need to add to the list. I know we've talked a little bit about combining things, removing things, that kind of thing, but it's also totally possible that there's gaps here. So that is definitely something that we want to be hearing from the providers, from the community, of whether there's additional items we should be adding to this list. So I'll leave that at that for now. And then we've hit on this a number of times. The other thing that we really do want to be considering for this program is that reporting piece. How do we improve the data in the CER, the reliability of that data, the accessibility of that data? How do we improve that data in a way that enables us to actually analyze it? Because it's really difficult to do that right now. So that is something we want to consider as a part of this process, how we structure these things in a way that actually makes that data useful. So, yeah, so there will be a lot to kind of continue on as we work through this process. But I really do, again, I appreciate you all being here today. I appreciate the conversation, the detail, the thoughtfulness here. I do want to point out just a few other things before we close up today. So we do have additional meetings on the calendar for other subgroups of the management plans work group. I know many of you attend multiple subgroups, so I wanted to make sure we mentioned these. The next meeting on the calendar is the TURF meeting, which is on January 23rd. We have a Safe Yield technical meeting on February 4th. And an ag meeting on March 3rd. We will get another Muni meeting to follow up and continue having these conversations on the BMPs, so we'll be scheduling another meeting of the Muni group. I will send out an email once we get that on the calendar. And the next meeting of the full management plans work group is on March 19th. I did also just really quickly want to mention that yesterday we published the notice for the hearing for the Phoenix 4th Management Plan. So that hearing will occur on February 10th. In this room, the formal public comment period opened with the publication of that notice yesterday and will run through the date of the hearing. So if you would like to provide written comments on the Phoenix 4th Management Plan, you can provide those to us in writing anytime between now and 5 p.m. on the 10th. All of that information is available on our website. All the meeting information is available on our website. And if you have questions about the logistics around that hearing or anything, you can reach out to us anytime. Or if you have other questions or comments about the management plans, you can reach out to us anytime at the managementplans@azwater.gov email. And yeah, I think that's about everything. I ran through a bunch of things really quick there. So again, we really do appreciate your time. We appreciate your engagement. The level of engagement and feedback that we've received from this crowd has been really excellent. So we really do appreciate all of your participation and time. So thank you for being here. That's it.